It's my pleasure to welcome you to this 2 days conference here at the Institute of Fine Arts. I will get back to the main issues to be discussed here in a minute. I wanted first to invite the other organizers of this event to say a few words. Some very basic housekeeping issues. There are coat racks in a small room on the other side of the hall if you're embarrassed with your belongings, wrappings and other things. The bathrooms are downstairs, and the rest of the morning will be spent here. So maybe I will invite first of all Mirko Zardini, who is the director of the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal, to say a few words. Mirko and the Centre have agreed to be co-organizers of this event with the IFA and Princeton University School of Architecture. It is for the CCA an extension of their study programs activities, and Mirko will say a few words to us. Mirko?
So, thank you very much, Jean-Louis. It is, of course, for us at CCA, a pleasure to be here. And to be here and to participate to this meeting, this symposium. Of course, architecture and war is a crucial theme. It's a crucial theme today. And I think that the Second World War could help us to understand, not in general terms, but in a very precise and specific way, how our idea of modernity has been shaped, and also some of the first reactions and critique of that. I'm sure that the contribution of today, they will help us to have a new insight view of this kind of problem and theme. I have to say that in a certain way, a lot of things which have been part of architectural and urban thinking after the Second World War, they've been shaped in the light of a general idea of modernity, progress, technology, which is deeply related to the Truman speech of 1949, in which he was referring to the technology as the tool for a continuous progress, which was humanity after the war could have faced. And I think that most of this contribution today would help, I think, to look at that in a different way. This is one of the themes that CCA is developing work. You know that we have some programs from exhibition to grants in the study center, which are more and more related to some general investigation that we are developing in Montreal, the Canadian Centre for Architecture. And of course, the other things that I just like to say is that it's really a pleasure for us to collaborate with the New York University Fine Arts Institutes and with Princeton University for this kind of events and this kind of research. This is a part of a strategy that the center has developed in the last years to increase this collaboration. And I'm sure that this one with Princeton and Institute of Fine Arts is going to be the first of a longer series. I have just to say also that in this long collaboration process, and that we started some time ago, one of the objective and one of the result of this research will be in the next year, the Canadian Centre and exhibition curated by Jean-Louis, Architecture in Uniform, which has a lot to do with the seminar that we are going to listened today. So I think that perhaps the second step, unless Princeton is able to invent something in between, it could be at the Canadian Center in 2010. Thank you very much.
Good morning. It is a pleasure to be here, and of course, again, my first job is to thank our co-sponsors and collaborators. We couldn't ask, in a way, for better collaborators, and I think it's particularly important to at this particular moment to look for the potential of synergies when institutions collaborate, and certainly with Mirko Zardini and the CCA in Montreal, and Jean-Louis Cohen on behalf of the Institute of Fine Arts, we really couldn't ask for a better group of collaborators. And of course, thanks in the first instance go to Jean-Louis. He flatters us by calling us co-organizers. Jean-Louis has really done the bulk of the work here, and there's something, Jean-Louis manages to pull off these events and make them look effortless. But I think anybody who's organized any one of these events knows it's never easy, it's never effortless, and the more effort you put in, the easier it is. I think Jean McEnroe said the more he practiced, the luckier he gets. So I think that's certainly true in Jean-Louis' case. Princeton is involved in part because of a seminar that Jean-Louis taught as a visiting professor a year ago. And again, this seems to me an instance when the seminar structure is working very well, when the students become equal contributors, and when a theme is sort of fleshed out through the dialogue of a seminar, which is, I believe, in part what happened in that course a year ago. PhD studies play a very important role at Princeton. Many of these PhD students are trained as architects, and so they bring a particular perspective as architects to their scholarship. And then on the other hand, the presence of these scholars at Princeton has a huge impact on the culture of the school itself. It sets a very high intellectual bar for the school as a whole. Well, I don't want to take up too much time. Others will comment in depth on the thematic, but looking over the abstracts, there are three things that jump out to me. The first, and perhaps the most obvious, is that any practice placed under the stress of the extreme conditions of wartime reveals something very particular about its structure, its organization, and its history. So there's something to be learned about examining a practice under these extreme conditions of stress. The second point is that looking at architecture and planning in wartime means looking at architecture in particular from a very broad perspective, not only individual buildings, but looking at architecture as infrastructure, as the organization of territory, all of the complex problems of strategy, tactics, and logistics, thinking about the role, for example, of industrial design and production. So again, it seems to me to be a valuable new perspective on architecture. And finally, I think again, when you look at architecture in wartime and under the pressures of extreme conditions of production, you look at architecture as much as a process as an artifact. And again, I think as a kind of methodological lesson to look at architecture much more from the complex process of production and implementation gives an important methodological insight. So welcome and enjoy. I look forward to the day.
Good. Can I have the first slide, which will be exactly the same, by the way. This is an amazing picture of the Chrysler tank arsenal built by Albert Kahn Associates in Detroit in 1940-41. In opening this Dance Today event, which is challenged by the beautiful weather outside, I want first of all to give some background on its origins. It has been already said, this symposium has emerged at the initiative, it's really interesting to say that, of two doctoral students from the Institute of Fine Arts, Anna Józefacka and Susan Schaefer, who had participated to a seminar held several years ago on architectural practice during the war. This event builds upon the work done at that time and also last year as I continued the research and the conversation at Princeton's School of Architecture. These seminars were both based on a series of hypotheses I had shaped some 10 years ago, beginning them to envision a research program that would be concluded by an exhibition. The Canadian Centre for Architecture has enthusiastically responded to this idea and has decided to include the project in its program for 2010, possibly in cooperation with the Dutch Architecture Institute, which would subsequently host the show in 2011. So there is a horizon. In this framework, this weekend symposium is an essential articulation in what is a rather long process and aims at exchanging ideas on the base of research done by scholars belonging to different generations, but with a clear emphasis on the findings of doctoral candidates or people I would call fresh doctors. It should be the first in a series of recurrent events focused on architecture at the Institute of Fine Arts. We are envisioning yearly meetings. We'll see what the economic situation will allow. But as such today, it is the result of the generous institutional and financial support of both the Canadian Centre and Princeton School of Architecture. So let me begin by expressing my gratitude to Mirko Zardini and Alexis Sornin, in charge of the CCA Study Center, and to Stan Allen for their resolute support to this initiative. At the IFA, the project has been warmly encouraged by the interim director, Michel Marincola, and made possible by the engagement of Kathy Hines and Christina Snelik at the Office of Public Affairs, and by the contribution of Jenny Roda and Jason Verone of Visual Resources. Thanks to whom everything will be glitchless today and tomorrow. The role of Anna Józefacka and Susan Schaefer has continued throughout the process to be essential in dealing with issues such as scheduling, discussing with participants and potential attendance, and organizing materially these 2 days of debate. And of course, I thank all the speakers, some of whom have traveled from as far as Japan, and the moderators who have sometimes come also a long way. I also thank Kenneth Frampton, who had committed to give a keynote address. He seems to be to some extent uncertain, so we'll see if he shows up eventually, and John Oakman, who will conclude the discussion tomorrow. But let me briefly establish the outline of the questions to be addressed here. The first assumption on which the symposium is based is that, in contrast to the picture given by nearly all histories of architecture of the 20th century, the Second World War has been a founding moment in the diffusion of modernism and in the process of modernization. Of course, problems dealing with the reconstruction of bombed cities have been discussed for decades and are subject to an increased scrutiny today in relationship, for instance, with issues of historic preservation, preserving post-war areas in Europe and elsewhere. But the episodes most directly related to the conflict have also a meaning in the field of architecture, urban planning, as well as in landscape design. Involving all the continents in a direct or indirect manner, this highly industrial war, the Second Industrial War, but one which was really, as Walter Benjamin famously said, the revenge of the forces of production. This war has unquestionably been a rightful fight of the democracies and their allies against criminal regimes. So let me say this, looking at this war, it might sound a little defensive, but it's really important. We're dealing here with a key episode in the fight of democracy against the barbarians. During the 8 years spanning from the Legion Condor bombing of Guernica, maybe you can dim the lights now a little bit, from the 8 years spanning from the bombing of Guernica to the atomic explosion over Hiroshima, all the generations and all the professions have been to a degree or another concerned by war, altogether global and total. Few human manifestations illustrate better the concept of total social fact defined by the anthropologist Marcel Mauss. Architects have not remained immune and idle during these years, and I could say that architecture as a practice as a whole has been drafted as such. If we look at this cover of Bruno Zevi's magazine Metron, issued in 1949, if I remember well, we see, going clockwise from top left, Erich Mendelssohn, who built a mock-up German city to test incendiary bombs in Utah. Alvar Aalto, who built war production facilities in Finland. Frank Lloyd Wright, who designed unbuilt factory housing. Erik Gunnar Asplund, well, he died too soon and belonged to a neutral country, so it doesn't belong to a picture. Richard Neutra, who built wartime factory housing in Texas and California. Mies van der Rohe, whose early IIT buildings were directly related to the war effort and whose projects, like the Museum for a Small City, were related to a sort of post-war projection of American architects. Walter Gropius, who built wartime factory housing, and Le Corbusier, who designed an ammunition factory and celebrated, rather strangely, the virtues of wartime huts for the progress of human civilization. If we enlarge the circle to a sort of portrait gallery of architects who were not part of the star system of modernism, an unending series of biographical episodes can be delineated, and here I'm just giving some examples. Albert Speer, of course, was the highest ranking of all wartime architects after having become the Reichs Minister for Armament and was an authentic war criminal and tried as such. Herbert Rimpel created a multinational architectural firm operating in all occupied countries of Europe. Konstantin Guccio here built bunkers in Hamburg. Friedrich Tams built flak towers in several German cities and in Vienna before becoming the happy planner of post-war Düsseldorf. Antonin Raimond also built, like Mendelssohn, a Japanese mock-up town in Utah, a Japanese one to test incendiary bombs. The landscape designer Dan Kiley designed the interiors of the Nuremberg trial rooms in 1945. So the landscape designers also drafted. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy here taught camouflage at his Chicago Institute of Design. Bertolt Dubetkin designed with all the Arab air raid protection schemes for London already in 1949. Konrad Waxman, here seen in an early photo, imagined a system of prefabricated houses for war and peace times, and also worked for the Utah bombing experiments. The Imses developed plywood shapes for airplane production. And also, of course, we have to be aware of the victims among the architects, of people whose wartime experience was not one like Le Corbusier's or Gropius or others, a period of professional development. Giuseppe Pagano, who died in Mauthausen here, and also of architects who were prisoners and still working as designers. Simon Circus, at the bottom right, survived Auschwitz, where he worked in the architectural office. And by the way, of course, you can suspect that my interest for these issues has a sort of autobiographical background. I've discovered that my mother, who was in Auschwitz and was working as a chemist in the chemistry lab, was using for experiments plants which had been grown in a greenhouse designed by Circus. If we leave aside the biographical trajectories, also if several of them will be monitored here today, there are of course many figures that condense the exceedingly complex relationship of architecture and war. These relationships develop within a new geography, as for the first time, hence the title of the lecture, the rear of the belligerent countries is hit by in-depth bombing, dissolving the age-old differentiation between front and rear. The first issue to be discussed is simply the elementary wartime experience of architects thrown under the uniform or as simple civilians in the whirlwind of combats, bombings, and subject to starvation and exile, an experience that changed them forever. In the sphere of design, the war enlarged the scale of projects and buildings, with the emergence of mega projects such as the Pentagon, in the making of which architects were engaged, or huge productive territories in the German Empire. The material dimension of an industrialist war can also be perceived in the experimental use of new technologies, such as laminated wood using new types of glues, light metals and plastics, all of which will be later adapted for peaceful purposes. Also, wartime scarcity led to a sort of proto-ecological sensitivity to economy and recycling. Here, this amazing concept for wood springs for mattresses developed by Moholy-Nagy in Chicago. The war also involved unprecedented planning efforts, and new methodologies were developed, such as operational research, which required the use of elaborate representations. The use of visual devices for war situation rooms, here one designed by Henry Dreyfus in the US, required the contribution of architects and designers, while the construction of a national consensus in the belligerent nations led to campaigns of information using all medias, from posters to film. Architectural expertise was also mobilized in the creation of camouflage schemes, sometimes extended to the dimensions of a city or a territory. What we see here is an amazing project for luring the Allied bombers away from the center of Hamburg by visually hiding the Innenalster, here, the interior Alster, and moving it to the south, to this other area by creating a fake network of streets. Whereas World War II had seen essentially painters working in the domain of camouflage, this time a different type of competence was used, much more based on scientific theories of perception. With the extended theaters of operation, the notion of deployment took new dimensions. Mobile, prefabricated devices such as the Bailey bridges, the Bailey bridges on the left were used on all the Allied fronts, and the Mulberry floating harbor on the right, built off the Normandy coast, has been one of the conditions of the landing successes there. Architecture also encountered, finally, in many ways, questions of identity and memory, from the projects participating to strategies of conquest, occupation, and annexation, to the numerous designs aiming at commemorating victory or at mourning victims. Here, the amazing parallel between a memorial plan by Wilhelm Kreis for the victory over the Soviet Union, and happily enough never built, and the other one designed at the same moment by Zakharov, a Soviet architect, for celebrating the victory in Stalingrad. Amazing. And of course, behind all these projects, we find, of course, the spirit of Boulet and other architects. On the base of 19 papers proposed and retained among some 70 that were submitted, 4 clusters have been shaped in order to allow for a fruitful discussion during these 2 days, focused on a wide range of national situations, from the US to Japan, passing through Great Britain, France, Italy, Belgium, Germany, Finland, Greece, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the Soviet Union. So the discussion today will be also worldwide discussion. The first cluster deals with infrastructure of various types, which participated to the preparation of war at the level of territorial devices or of building technologies, and to its administration. The recording of the destruction of the same infrastructures is also part of wartime activities in which planners were engaged and will be discussed. The second group of papers deals with specific technologies, and in particular with new questions raised since the early 1930s by the aerial menace. Architects were engaged in the designs of bunkers and of camouflage schemes, sometimes of delirious proportions like the ones we saw. These programs were only one part of broader sets of actions related with the technological side of the war and with the economy at large. A third group of problems to be discussed deals with architectural endeavors related to the occupation of conquered territories, in which strategies of colonization but also of monumental marking took place. State policies contrast with astonishing resistance schemes such as the one in Warsaw, which will be presented by Anna. Here we see the crazy projects by the Lukard brother for the university city in Bratislava, which was submitted to a competition won by an Italian team, a rare example of international competition organized within the Nazi system of power. Finally, the fourth panel focuses on wartime strategies for post-war reconstruction, both at the scale of the domestic environment and at the scale of national territories. Besides the challenge of reconstruction after an unprecedented wave of destruction, the war appeared in many cases, as we see here with this British caricature, as an opportunity for the reshaping of cities and territorial structures of entire nations. Of course, many issues have been left and will be left out from an already very densely packed weekend, but these 2 days should allow for an intense confrontation of viewpoints, contributing, I hope, to confirming the historical centrality of the episodes considered. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's an honor to organize or to coordinate the first session today. The thematics, the general idea of this conference brings me back to our history of research during the last generation. Some of the participants today took part already in the early 80s in a meeting we organized in Hamburg dealing with the architecture and urban planning in Europe during the war. It was called Faschistische Architekturen. So we looked on the evil side of the story, and we compared the situation in the within Europe, and we all were struck by the heterogeneity of the architecture developed during this period, and this for us was it was really a stroke on our conviction that architecture and content have a direct connotation. And we found out that architecture is much more flexible and much more independent from the political systems than we thought before. And this idea followed, had some in the years to come, brought us to rethink the general architectural history perspective, which is always which at this time was based on a good modernity and a bad traditionalism, and the direct relation of Nazi policy with the architecture of Albert Speer and things like this. You all know this. And we find out that there are other very important elements in this history, which mainly the question of modernization. And modernization for us became a very central subject when we started a research dealing with Germany and France, the relations in architecture and planning in Germany and France in the period from 1940 to 1950. At this moment, it was very rare to have research that looked on the continuities across the political historical ruptures. In this case, the rupture of 1940, and we did not take 1940 as a starting point or a final point. We put it in the center, And by doing so, our perspective of the history of, in this case, German and French architecture changed dramatically. We found, and it was also shocking for us to find out how much the discourse on architecture and urban planning had changed during the wartime. How many influences could be traced in the archives and personal histories of architects working on this side and on the other side, and also ideas, the flow of ideas. And the general thematic of this flow of ideas was the participation of the architects in the modernization of territory, the modernization, the preparation of the territory for political goals during the wartime and also in the Reconstruction period. And the political systems were a little bit taken. They had to be removed from the first rank. What architects are doing and planners are doing became the central issue of this kind of research, without omitting the political implications of their work. Nobody worked independent from political conditions in Eastern Europe or in the Western countries or in the fascist or Nazi occupied territories of Europe. From a more dogmatic perspective on the development of architecture, taking the modernity as the only expression of modernization, we came to a broader view, which also included the process of the thinking of planning, the idea of organizing the architect as an organizer, not as an artist. An idea which was very important, especially in the post-war period, that the artistical aspect of architecture was destroyed. The understanding of the architect became different and more technocratic, more pragmatic, and all these processes are here in this first session on a central place. It's not so much the architecture as an artifact, the architecture as planning, the architecture as a contribution to social transformations and political applications during wartime, preparation of war, and overcoming the destruction of the war. So I think this is sufficient for the introduction, and I invite the speakers to come